This conference will now be recorded.
Can anyone hear me?
No.
Okay, I'm getting comments that say yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okie doke. So, Dr. Mirchi, we are going to let you begin.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike, for the kind introduction and invitation. It's a pleasure to join this group and interact more. I'm an assistant professor of water resources engineering at Oklahoma State University's Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. I've been there since August, and so still have connections to the Middle Rio Grande region in terms of collaborating with colleagues in doing the research that I was a part of when I was at the University of Texas at El Paso. And what I'm going to present on today is part of a bigger project that is funded by the USDA CAP program. It's a $5 million project which is ongoing currently. And in that project, the project is led by UTEP, but it has multiple partners, Texas A&M, Acknowledgments Research Center in El Paso, University of New Mexico State University, University Autónoma Ciudad Juárez, and Michigan Technological University, and most recently OSU. So I appreciate the contributions of colleagues and students who are working on different parts of the project, and I'm just going to highlight some aspects related to watershed modeling and climate change impact assessment. Okay, so a little bit about our study area. We're focusing on part of the Rio Grande Basin that we call the Middle Rio Grande Basin. So basically starts upstream of the Elephant Butte Reservoir in southern New Mexico and far west Texas. And so the part of the Middle Rio Grande River Basin that I'm going to be talking mostly about today is the part that is shown in the larger inset. It's the watershed that contains Elephant Butte Irrigation District, right on the international border with Mexico and touching the state line with Texas. There is a USGS gauging station upstream of the city of El Paso, which allows us to look at the outflow hydrograph, which is a good benchmark for us to be evaluating the performance of our models in terms of the ability to capture stream flow at that location. But other than being a growing population center, Las Cruces and El Paso and Ciudad Juárez, borderplex that has a population of more than 2 million people and growing. The area has a good amount of agricultural activity, as this chart summarizes the acreage of different crops in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District from 1994 to 2012. Of course, one of the big cash crops in the area is pecans. So pecan is a beloved crop down there because all of the economic profit that it generates. But there are other crops: corn, cotton, peppers, vegetables, alfalfa, and other things. And one thing to note about this chart, summarizing the acreage of crops over the years, is that how the acreage of some of the crops changes over the years. For example, if you pick alfalfa, you see that the area shrinks in 2010, 2012, and that's around the time that the area was hit by a severe drought. But the area of pecan remains pretty much stable. And if you look at 2012, I mean, it has not decreased over time. If anything, it's gained a little bit of acreage over the years, and it's justified by the economic attractiveness of this crop, of course. So this chart shows, the importance of this region in terms of pecan production in general. And we know that New Mexico, the state of New Mexico, is the second producer of pecan in the United States, tracing Georgia pretty closely. And so the green bars show pecan production in the state of New Mexico, and the yellow bars show pecan production in our study area. So that, basically shows that the majority of pecan production in the state of New Mexico actually happens within the confines of the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. So that's the most important crop that the farmers will tend to want to protect. This slide summarizes the status of water resources in the region, in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. What you see on the right-hand side is a satellite image of Elephant Butte Reservoir, started in 1990, and how it changes if the animation works on the PowerPoint presentation. Let's hope that it does. Going all the way to 2017, so it shows how the surface area of this reservoir changes over the years in drought years and intermittent wet years. The bar charts on the top summarizes the groundwater pumping. Source of data is USGS, and associated with that, there is a solid blue line that shows the groundwater table decline. And so the graph on the bottom shows standardized precipitation index, which basically tells which years have been dry, which years have been wet. So anywhere that you see red, it denotes a dry year, and blue denotes a wet year. And let's see what happens in this region over the years as we move, we alternate between wet years and dry years, so we can see that signal of conjunctive management of water resources. When there is a drought, there is more pressure on groundwater resources. Wet years tend to be more favorable in terms of having surface water. And you will notice in later years of the satellite image of Elephant Butte Reservoir, those red patches appearing in the water course and in the reservoir, and that just shows the vegetation that's taking hold as that water course and the reservoir is becoming drier, and it's becoming a suitable habitat for all the vegetation. So it shows that the region in general is getting drier. So this project that we have, it brings together various expertise, and we basically have framed this research around answering the question: how can water be managed so that the three main users, agriculture, urban or industrial users, and environmental users, can sustain and secure a sustainable future in the Middle Rio Grande Basin? And it's a challenging task for reasons that we'll see a little bit of down the road in this presentation. But we established good communication avenues with stakeholders, good interaction with the various stakeholders at the policy level, at operational level, basically suppliers and distributors of water in the area. And we've tried to reach all the way down to the individual users in the area. But what my colleagues have done, Bill Hargrove and Joe Hyman, they have collected all the perspectives of different stakeholders, identified their priorities, what they care about, what questions they want answered as part of this research. So that stakeholder input has allowed us to frame research questions, and associated with that, we want to identify drivers of change in this region and evaluate the impact of those drivers of change. Climatic extremes is an obvious one. And then identify, look at some of the potential solutions that helps, adapt the system to those stressors. We're using a lot of modeling and data analysis in this process, and we want to evaluate potential interventions that can sustain water resources, maybe a little bit beyond, in a way that can handle those stressors. So for watershed modeling parts of the work, we're using a well-known and widely used watershed simulation model called Soil and Water Assessment Tool. And the cartoon on the right-hand side basically shows a water balance that is generated by SWAT, an aggregate water balance, different processes that are represented anywhere, so basically there are two primary sources of water in this region. One is the Rio Grande flow that's regulated, so it can literally be shut off and on at the Caballo Regulatory Reservoir. And other than that, we get precipitation into the system. There are various processes affecting the availability and flow of water in this region, like infiltration, lateral flow, and of course, thinking back about all the agricultural activities, there's heavy irrigation in the region, so that makes things challenging in terms of modeling because we have to reproduce all those important components of the water budget, being streamflow, evapotranspiration, groundwater recharge. Those are all affected by agricultural activities. We want to account for conjunctive water use. Of course, there's a dynamic crop pattern in the region, and current version of SWAT that we're using is limited in that area. So there are some assumptions that affect our results, but we're aware of these. And of course, we always want to see more observational data. So SWAT has been used around the world. So this is a map and chart that summarizes application of SWAT to arid and semi-arid irrigated agricultural regions around the world. And something that we noticed in this literature review effort was that SWAT has been applied for analyzing water quality issues, water quantity issues, and both water quality quantity issues in irrigated and in arid, semi-arid, irrigated agricultural areas. But what happens is, it's shown in that scale, is that a lot of times modelers use Streamflow as the primary or maybe the sole calibration component. And what we have found in our work is that can be insufficient, because a good Streamflow simulation does not necessarily translate into good evapotranspiration simulation or recharge simulation. So that's something that we wanted to be mindful of. Some basic inputs of SWAT. So basically, it uses topographic information in terms of digital elevation models, land use, land cover information, and soil map to divide the watershed into different hydrologic response units. So we have, in this particular watershed, 7% of the watershed area is agricultural. The watershed has been divided into 10 subbasins. Number of HRUs is more than 7,000 HRUs. Evapotranspiration calculation method is Hargreaves and Samai, and we're using auto irrigation to meet crop water demands. And so this time series shows how we are simulating observational streamflow data at the El Paso gauge. We've used different calibration methods, basically single component, which looks only at streamflow, and multi-component, in which we try to capture both streamflow and stay very close to estimates of evapotranspiration and groundwater recharge in the region. And as shown in the summary statistics of model performance, we're doing pretty good in applying both of those approaches to this watershed. So we're capturing the seasonality, peaks and troughs of streamflow at the El Paso gauge over the years. And so overall, we can call this calibration good. And another important to remember how important Pecan was in this region was to have a good handle on simulating evapotranspiration of Pecan in the region. And these charts basically summarize the orange dots show the SWAT simulated evapotranspiration for Pecan, and these have been overlaid on top of measured Pecan data, the data that was available from, it was published in a paper by Dr. Samis from New Mexico State University in 2004, I believe it's 2001 and 2002. The two charts are summarizing those. Again, we cannot. I mean, it's very hard to have exact matching of the values of ET, but we're in the ballpark, and I think we're doing a pretty good job with that as well. Looking at the evapotranspiration and other crops, we have the alfalfa, we have evapotranspiration in agricultural areas, non-agricultural areas, we have recharge. And again, in applying different calibration methods, especially with multi-component calibration, abbreviated as MCC2 in this chart, we have tried to stay close to estimates of recharge and basically ET in agricultural and non-agricultural areas for different crops in different parts of the basin. And then we use the calibrated model to look at baseline water budget. So inputs, we're seeing precipitation, inflow, and irrigation, and losses from the system are evapotranspiration, groundwater recharge, and outflow. And so we have a baseline understanding of the system. There's a lot of irrigation happening, as you see in the summary chart. And then, so we were able to simulate a spatially distributed representation of the evapotranspiration. As is expected, a lot of evapotranspiration takes place along the Rio Grande, where those orchards and agricultural fields are located. So we're happy to see the result that the evapotranspiration is shown in darker color and happening along that area in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. Another parameter that we're interested in, because it contributes to groundwater, is a spatial distribution of recharge. Again, because of the irrigation application that we have in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District, we're seeing a concentration of larger recharge values in that area. And another important point about this map is that there are pockets of high recharge volumes very close to the reservoirs in the upper boundary of the watershed. So there's some dark blue that's showing up over there. And so basically when there's a release in the reservoir, we let the auto-irrigated function of SWAT take charge of distributing the irrigation water, so we have a lot of recharge in that region. Now the bigger question was, okay, we're seeing the drivers have changed, or there's concerns about how climate is going to change, and there may be climatic extremes in terms of extremely dry conditions, persistent dry conditions over time, and we wanted to look at those conditions and see what do they mean. What are the implications of those in terms of the regional water budget in this region? And based on the interaction with the stakeholders, my colleagues have been bringing this up time and time again, and I think it's a fascinating thing that the farmers are looking at in that region. They've been telling us to take the worst drought on record and simulate something worse. So they're expecting, they're aware of the worst case conditions that are impending in the future, and they want to know what that might look like and stuff like that. So the map here shows the Palmer Drought Severity Index of the 1950s drought, and you see the most extreme drought happen in that region, as is shown by the very dark kind of brownish color that in the far west Texas and southern New Mexico, and that was the worst drought on record. And so we're seeing in 2012, in May 2012, which is typically the irrigation season, so the river should be flowing. The river actually ran dry because the area was hit by another severe drought, and that just shows the direness of the situation. But other than that, over the years, this is a region that gets water when there's water released from the reservoir. It doesn't get any water when the water is not released. So there are cases that, if you look at the stream flow, there are cases that, there's large stream flow but other times there could be small stream flow or even none. And we've thought about this in terms of bounding the hydrologic responses of this region, because we could either have an ideal situation that the stream flow can run at like a wet year, can continue running like a wet year, but it could, the worst case is that there is no release from the reservoir. That's like the worst nightmare in terms of surface water availability. So that, gives us, two scenarios right there. And we have, Dr. Dave Gutzler out of University of New Mexico and his team have been working on generating stream flow scenarios feeding Elephant Butte Reservoir. So we have, in this particular presentation, I'm showing also the projected inflows produced by, the HAJM GCM under a very the extreme carbon emission scenario, which is RCP 8.5. Some summary data about what this HAJM climate scenario looks like. Basically, it shows an increasing trend in minimum temperature and maximum temperature, and it shows a declining trend in precipitation. So mean precipitation, the decrease is projected to be about 20% into the future. So if we use the model and we, compare the baseline condition in terms of precipitation, irrigation, evapotranspiration, groundwater recharge, compare it to a no-release condition that uses the projected climate information. So basically, we see a decrease in precipitation. We see a radical decrease in irrigation. Evapotranspiration commensurately declines, and there's much less groundwater recharge. So that shows how this area is pressed for water. There's a lot less water under this scenario. It's an extreme case. But basically, we're coming up with some ways to, to put in perspective how these components of the water budget could shrink if there's a lot less water available. Now, looking at the baseline compared to, so the green bars represent the baseline, and the yellow bars represent an extended drought as another projected climate scenario. Extended drought means take the 2012 drought of the region and repeat it over into the future. We see sharp decline in irrigation, about maybe more than 50%. Also associated with that, there's 50% decline in ET, which means loss of agricultural crop in the region. And then we have reduced shallow groundwater recharge, and we have reduced deep groundwater recharge, which obviously have implications for groundwater sustainability in the region. Now, the bar charts, the blue bars to the right, they depict a rosy scenario that, if we have those wet stream flow conditions persisting into the future, obviously we're going to be less stressed and we're going to do better in terms of irrigation, ET, and it's going to be, everything is going to look good in terms of water availability in the region, as shown in larger bars showing the max inflow scenario. So we also want to look at some interventions and see how we can prolong water availability in the region. So the approach we're taking is we're working with the future conditions like projected climate, precipitation and temperature. In this case, the monthly HAJM output, annual agricultural lands, and everything stays the same as it was, and there is no release from Caballo Reservoir, and a groundwater withdrawal stays the same at 2013 level. So those are the basic assumptions. And then in terms of management scenarios, we can continue the business as usual into the future. We can look at some interventions, although SWAT doesn't allow us to explicitly simulate those intervention scenarios like drip irrigation or deficit irrigation. There are some assumptions that we can make. There are some parameters that we can change, and we can look at how that impacts different components of the water budget. And then there are some radical scenarios of reducing irrigation water and maybe not using any water for cotton and vegetable. Just a disclaimer, these are just the exercises that we're testing, the different interventions, so we're not even sharing that with the stakeholders publicly, but this is for our own academic exercise. And it's for this reason that we have a scenario like no crop and all pecan. We want to see how the model reacts to these very extreme punches and see what are the impacts of that. So some charts that summarize these conditions. We have the baseline represented in dark blue bars. We have the no cotton, no vegetable water use scenario shown in the light blue bars, and then we have the business as usual. So if there is a little bit of water saved, for example, as was shown in that chart that I showed about acreages of different crops up front in this presentation, we see by sacrificing some cotton and vegetable, there is some opportunity to generate more stream flow at the El Paso gauge in the downstream of our study area. So that can help technically with sustaining water a little bit longer. Drip irrigation also has some advantages with the disclaimer that we haven't simulated this explicitly. It can save some water, and it can generate some water for downstream users. And also, but interestingly, if we remove all the crops, of course, we're going to get a lot more stream flow exiting this system, which this is probably never going to happen, and it's not intended to relay that it should. But so the outflow hydrograph into the future looks a lot like the baseline condition. But if we switch to all pecan, again, that's going to take a lot of the water, so it's going to push back that water availability. That shows how water hungry pecans are in that region. So in summary, in this project, we're applying a stakeholder-driven modeling approach to understand various water futures in the Middle Rio Grande Basin. And the study area that I focused on today is the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. We're applying watershed modeling using SWAT, Soil Water Assessment Tool. We're using a calibrated version of this tool to conduct to evaluate potential impacts of extreme and mid-range climate futures. We're already demonstrating the vulnerability of agricultural production to water shortage if there are extreme water scenarios, for example, no release from the Caballo Reservoir actually unfold. And of course, those scenarios have important implications for groundwater sustainability because the users are not just going to absorb that water shortage stress. They're going to switch to groundwater resources in the conjunctive management scheme. So there's a question of groundwater sustainability in this region. And we want to use these models to interact with stakeholders in the coming year. And we also want to do the climate change impact assessment using coupled SWAT flow models to have both surface water and groundwater representation. We're also looking at simulating salinity using SWAT, using the new capabilities that have been developed at Colorado State University with Brian Bailey's team. And we want to basically use all of these data and capabilities to facilitate a dialogue about future challenges and adaptation opportunities in Middle Rio Grande Basin. So with that, I want to acknowledge partners, colleagues at different universities, also the United States Department of Agriculture for funding this research. And thank you again, Mike, for extending an invitation. It's an honor to be here. And thank you all for tuning in, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mirchi. We are open to questions now, either by chat if you will send messages in by chat or by phone. So, any questions for Dr. Mirchi? I have a couple. Go ahead.
I have one too. Thank you, Dr. Mirchi.
Sure.
I was curious because I noticed in the future projections that you were using, it was just based entirely on the HADGEM model simulation. I'm curious why that choice and why not use more?
This is a test case, so we're using more. I mean, basically, we're going by the downscaled GCM products that are available. There are products of the Bureau of Reclamation.
Mm-hmm.
So they have looked at, I think, 36 in their most recent technical memo. They have reported 36, I think, GCM outputs that they have downscaled, and they have ran those projected climates through variable infiltration capacity model, the VIC model, to turn those into Streamflow. Now that what that needs to be usable in our application is to account for upstream water management effects, because what the outputs of variable infiltration capacity model is basically the unimpaired or natural flow conditions, if you will.
Right.
So Dave Gutzler and his team out of University of New Mexico, they're developing procedures to basically come up with normalization constants to transform those projected stream flows into things that we can use to feed Elephant Butte irrigation, Elephant Butte Reservoir, which marks the upstream boundary of our study area. So we are looking at a whole host of GCM outputs.
Okay, so it's ultimately the VIC outputs based upon those.
VIC outputs normalized to account for human impacts upstream.
And this is, I'm sorry, just for following up, but this is VIC outputs that are done by Bureau of Reclamation?
That's right.
Okay, just making sure I had that right.
Ali, would you mind scrolling back 2 slides to show your conclusions for everybody? There we go. Just leave it there, please. So we've got several questions in. I feel like a radio DJ or something. We've got several questions in on the hotline. Gene and Dave ask, first I thank you for your presentation, and they ask, what is the impact of seasonality of these processes in addition to the annual perspective? So you did yours on an annual perspective. Have you taken the time to separate it into perhaps what happens in the summer? I assume that the pecans need more water in the summer. They're probably not growing much in the winter.
Right.
So go ahead.
Right. So they're dormant. Pecans are dormant over winter time, and that's why the river doesn't run and during the winter. So it only flows during the irrigation season because they release water at the Caballo Reservoir. So, I mean, in terms of the water budget, the winter time is not really the critical time for us. I mean, of course, we report things on an annual basis because I think that's probably going to be more easily understood in our stakeholder interaction meetings. But the majority of the hydrologic action is actually taking place during the growing season, and precipitation is an input to the system, but I mean it's dwarfed if you look at the surface water inflow that's managed at the Caballo Reservoir. The majority of the precipitation input occurs during the monsoonal activity in late summer, early fall in that region, August, September. So that's also part of the growing season. So that's why I say, that annual bar charts that I showed, they probably are heavily impacted by that growing season condition.
That makes sense. Okay, next question. From the folks at the Bureau of Reclamation in Albuquerque, they asked, what are the adaptation strategies that you plan to model in the future phases of the research? So as you mentioned on this slide, stakeholder interaction using results from the SWAT. So will you be modeling some additional management scenarios, and will those come from the stakeholders?
Right. So yes. So we have been So one of the challenges of working with stakeholders and working on a problem that has real implications is that the problem changes as the project moves on. So we started with a set of questions up front, but we're facing new questions. For example, that question of salinity that listed on the towards the bottom is a question that's just coming up because people are getting more and more concerned about salinity in that part of the basin. Some farmers argue that they use flood irrigation just to flush out the salt buildup in the upper layers of the soil in the pecan orchards. There are some innovative approaches to partially flood the pecan orchards, for example. There are some tech-savvy farmers who have already implemented drip irrigation, for example, or deficit irrigation. And some people argue that they do not work. They're not. They can't handle the salinity problem. Some people argue that it's just going to work. So that's why we want to look at that kind of intervention scenarios, like what if there is a higher efficiency agricultural irrigation? How can we mix and match surface water and groundwater to see if we can prolong the life of the aquifer? And what are the salinity impacts? So those are all ongoing questions that some of them may not be answered by the end of this project, but there's always future work, and we can keep working on it.
So the salinity simulation using SWAT, is that salinity in the water or in the soil or both?
It is. Well, this is a modification of the SWAT code that's been done by Ryan Bailey out of Colorado State University. It does account for the salinity in the river system, so it's a land surface salinity simulation. But it does also account for the geochemical processes that govern the fate of 8 major salt ions in that region in the near surface as well. So we're testing that model. We have a new, just a fresh set of results that we have to analyze. And we've gotten real salinity measurements in 2014, 2015 from a colleague at the UTEP Department of Geology in a result of a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation. So I want to piece together all of these data and model products to see if the salinity simulations that we're doing make sense, and what does that mean in terms of the intervention to combat this problem.
Okay. Next question is from Austin Hansen. And he says, you might want to scroll back to the slides that showed 2 inflows, precip and irrigation, and 2 outflows, ET and groundwater. I think they were bar charts, those right there. He asks, does irrigation represent surface water only here? Is that
It does.
Okay.
It does, yes. So it's not a realistic condition because in reality, farmers would switch to groundwater, but this is just an image that we wanted to say, okay, if you keep groundwater at the level that you were using before, so it's not surface water only, but it doesn't account for that dynamic feedback of adding more groundwater to compensate for the surface water that you're now not getting. So good observation.
Okay. Also, the folks at the Bureau of Rec in Albuquerque asked, are we going to share the slides? I'd be happy to distribute them if you're comfortable with that.
Of course, we can share the slides. I mean, there are some material that I should give credit to others, but I can go back and write those credits and share the slides with you.
Perhaps the simplest thing to do would be to put them on a website so that people could download them. It's probably a pretty big file.
Yep.
So we'll try to do something and let everybody know by the next time we have one of these seminars. So the next question comes in from our acting director, Dr. Carolyn Enquist, and she asks next steps in terms of stakeholder engagement. You mentioned that some of the management scenarios were purely academic. How do you intend to make them more accessible or useful for the stakeholders as you move forward?
Yeah, so the academic exercises of intervention are for us to, test the performance of the model to make sure that things are making sense. Because SWAT has a multitude of parameters. So you change something, everything else is going to change. So you have to put the model to those stress tests. But in terms of interacting with stakeholders, we're going to go back to the questions that they provided up front. So they're very much concerned about, for example, groundwater sustainability. They want to know how dire is that situation. If they keep pumping, how much longer can they continue pumping? When might they run out of groundwater? It's basic. Groundwater is the backbone of water sustainability, basically in the arid regions, and so we have different tools. Like I said, we're working on a coupled SWAT flow model to answer that type of question. That's a more sophisticated tool that we're working on. But we also have some spreadsheet models. Those are simple models that Alex Mayer out of Michigan Tech has been working on. And one way to look at those questions would be to feed water budget data from SWAT to that spreadsheet model of groundwater stocks in the region to see how these future climate conditions are going to affect the life of groundwater. And that's going to be a key question that the stakeholders have. Other questions are related to salinity. That's why we've recently started using the SWAT salt, and we're working on that. And in terms of intervention, I think what we want to do is show stakeholders, especially in the agricultural community, a few examples, not that we're dictating or anything or we're prescribing anything. So we want to basically give them what is the baseline condition, what might the future hold, what are some example interventions. They might hate that, they might add input, so there are all kinds of things that will happen, and we want to adapt the use of our tools to answer the questions that keep coming up.
Another question for the folks at Bureau of Rec in Albuquerque. They mentioned that pecans need hard freezes in order for them to get ready for productivity and harvest. What are the implications of climate change for the future of these hard freezes in the pecan growing region there?
Well, I haven't looked at that question closely, but I mean, my gut feeling is it should have some. I'm not that familiar with the physiology of pecan production, but it should be an area of concern because those temperatures are going up. Already, we're seeing in that region the freeze time is being pushed back, so the duration of time, the first freeze and the last freeze, is getting shorter. So, not being a pecan production expert, I think that's going to have some negative impacts.
Okay. We also happen to have Dr. Adrian Wooten, who has done extensive work on downscaling climate data in this particular region and just gave a talk on that very topic yesterday. So, Dr. Wooten, can you speak to this question?
I can, to some of that in the area. So it is with changes in temperature, it does change the length of the growing season, in most cases projected to increase dramatically by the middle of the century, on the order of a month or more, increasing the length of the growing season. But at the same time, what your observation is correct, that the last freeze is becoming earlier in the year. And it's also to continue to be earlier in the year. In some places, that would be 3 weeks or more earlier in the year, particularly in the mountainous regions of New Mexico, where the warming is projected to be some of the greatest. But in some of the other regions in southern New Mexico, in the region of the Yellowstone Basin, one of the projections that we see is to see the last freeze of the year come 2 weeks or more earlier. Which would, yes, I think be detrimental to pecan production. And in general, just speaking, as the temperatures get warmer, there will be less of those hard freezes to work with.
Okay. Here's a pretty technical question about the model itself. Someone asks, is there a fully distributed version of SWAT available for easily coupling with ModFlow?
So, I mean, well, SWAT is a spatially distributed software. It's available for free. There's an active user community, and so that's one of the good things about the model. Now, no model is perfect. That's why I started hand waving a little bit, when I was talking about simulation of the actual irrigation methods. So yes, a fully functional version of SWAT is out there that can be coupled with ModFlow. And actually, again, Colorado State University researchers have been very active in developing those coupling interfaces, the SWAT ModFlow interface. And so they can be, I mean, there are some kinks, as you can imagine. So the way it works is that SWAT HRUs are the numbering system is translated in a way to connect with ModFlow grid cells, and that connection happens in that fashion. But the answer is yes, and I would refer you to the SWAT website, and I can share a link if that's needed.
Next question, again from Dr. Enquist. Do you have plans to introduce the concept of environmental flows into this work? That way you could reach a broader audience and not just be focused on agriculture, but perhaps be focusing on environmental impacts.
Absolutely, absolutely. So actually, we've already developed that idea, and we're thinking seriously about, again, the topic is very controversial. So, but we want to know what are the impacts, and so that information should be generated out there. So we want to look at different scenarios of environmental flow. We want to look at their hydrologic impacts. We want to look at their hydroeconomic impacts, and share those with stakeholders. We have a lot of interest in that question from environmental advocacy groups. The question is a lot more sensitive when you reach out to the farmers. So again, some complications of working with the real stakeholders on the ground, but we have that question on our radar. We already formed a team, we've extended the work, and we have a good game plan for that. So,
terrific. Have you examined the uncertainty in the climate change projections that impact ag systems, such as pecans? Have you looked at the uncertainty?
Well, that ties back to the question of working with the whole set of available GCM output. So we're moving in that direction, but the findings in terms of our uncertainty, in terms of different climate indicators, are pretty clear. They're all over the place. The trends, you can see increases in minimum temperature, for example, maximum temperature. But in terms of the actual breadth of that spectrum of uncertainty, they're all over the place, and they can have important implications for that. How much crop yield is there, how that's going to affect the water budget component. But I think in terms, so we want to look at those uncertainties, but we want to speak in terms of the trends and percent changes, because we cannot claim that we can predict the future accurately using this framework. All we want to do is produce some information that's useful, and it can be used in the water management dialogue. So,
another modeling question. Someone asks, which ModFlow model will you be using to link to SWAT?
Let's see. It's the 2007 version, 2005, 2007 version, because they have to have. I have to go check that, but the 2005 version should work. I think that's the version that Ryan Bailey and his team have used for developing the coupling framework. But I can double check and get back with you on that.
Any other questions? This has been great. clearly a lot of interest, judging by the number of questions that we got. I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance today and point out, and I failed to do this at the beginning, that the Southern Plains Climate Science Seminar Series is a collaborative effort of three organizations, three federal climate organizations here in central Oklahoma. We start with SCIP, which is the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. I think I got that right for the first time in my life. They are a function of NOAA, and they are headquartered at both LSU and University of Oklahoma. Dr. Mark Schaefer is the leader here at the University of Oklahoma. He's one of our partners in this. And also the good folks out at the USDA Southern Plains Climate Hub in El Reno, Oklahoma. David Brown is the executive director there, and they are our partners in this. And then I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mike Langston, and I'm the deputy director here at the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And as I mentioned earlier, on the phone is Dr. Carolyn Enquist, who is our acting director. So with that, and seeing no more other questions, are there any questions on the phone? If you can, I don't think everybody's muted on the phone. I think you can get through. I'll give you just a second. Okay, I hear none. Oh, no, I hear none. So thank you all for attending, and do you recall when our next one will be? Is it two months from today?
August 7th, I believe, but
okay.
I would have to double check on that. An email will be coming out to everybody.
So set aside this time on what I think is Wednesday, August the 7th. If the 7th of August is a Wednesday, then at that time you can expect that, yes it is, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Eastern or Central Time, 10 o'clock in the morning Central Time, we will have another seminar, and expect an announcement in your email inbox, or your in-mail box, if you're talking too fast. Thank you all, and I'm going to end the call now. Goodbye.